So the steam engine is so what happens is um you start a fire, it boils water, the water creates steam, the steam travels up these pipes into a piston, into a compressor unit. It powers the piston to move up, it pushes this arm up, the arm moves up, there's a valve, it releases the steam, the arm comes back down, up and down it goes. This means so again, once you produce the steam engine, right, now it doesn't you don't need to have manpower, you don't need to have muscle power. People can, people get tired, people need a break. A steam engine doesn't need it as long as you have coal to power it. James Watt is the guy who, uh, re-engineers this. Does anybody recognize his last name? W-A-T-T. Daniel?
It's a unit of power.
It is, right? This is, probably most familiar to us is our light bulbs, right? A 65-watt light bulb or whatever the case might be. Excellent. The other important piece about the steam engine is that when you power your power looms or when you power your items with it, you can now move your factories away from rivers and streams, right? Rivers and streams were the ways that we, powered machinery before, right? You hook up a water wheel, the water flows into this wheel and moves the gear so that you could power your machinery, but you had to be by a river or a stream. Now you could take those rivers and those streams, you could take those factories and move them away from the rivers and the streams, and this helps lead to industrialized urbanization, right? It helps us lead to a um,
Yeah.
helps us lead to urbanization where people don't need to be tied again to the rivers and the streams. And again, if you attach this to any of those other industrial products, it makes it makes that production that much easier. You'll notice here that I give about a 20-year break between the first and the second phase. The first phase ends around 1820. I consider the 20 years between 1820 and 1840 to be sort of like a gestational period, a period where there is if businesses are starting, for railroads, tracks are being laid, cities are becoming more populated. So there's about a 20-year period here where there's this gestational period. So from 1840 to 1914, you have this second phase, and it is important because it sees the expansion of the Industrial Revolution outside of just Western Europe and goes to Germany, right? So by 1840 or so, you have the beginning of industrialization in what will become Germany. Russia gets involved on a lesser scale, but Russia gets involved nonetheless. Other parts of Eastern Europe, and most importantly, Japan. Now, we will not talk a ton about Japan because this is a European history course, but it is important for us to know that Japan will also be involved here in the 1800s, particularly by the 1880s. And Japan will have one of the fastest industrializations in the world, in world history. It only takes Japan about 10 years to become industrialized. Shamir, go ahead.
Sorry.
That's
Wasn't Japan like premium for like the longest time? Then some guy brought in like cannons or something like that.
Yep, you're absolutely right. So Japan was, as Shamir rightly says, Japan was feudal, was very sort of almost like medieval Europe up until about the 1850s, 1860s. And then there's an American, a guy named Matthew Perry, a Commodore, a naval officer, who sails into what would become Tokyo Harbor. and basically forces them to open up. He does that in 1853. He comes back in 1854, and Japan, the sort of embarrassment that Japan suffers leads to a huge mobilization of industrial power, and it becomes, as I say, one of the largest industrialized countries in a span of about 10 years. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, there's a movie on this.
There is.
Yeah, I forgot the name though. I think it's with the guy who played in American Psycho.
Is that Christian Bale?
Yeah, I think Christian Bale's in it.
I'll have to look it up. Thanks. All right. So the second phase of the Industrial Revolution is characterized by the railroad. This is the era of the railroad. This is the era where railroad lines will crisscross throughout the world, throughout Britain, France, America, Germany, and I have a map down here that helps to illustrate that. And we'll talk more about railroads when we see each other again. This is also the era where, as railroad lines are moving, as railroad lines are going across these different countries, different cities, towns, whatever, they're also going to start laying telegraph cables so that people can start to communicate with one another. And finally, steel, right? As cities begin to grow, as cities become more urbanized, there's going to need to be apartment buildings and higher and more developed, infrastructure. So we will have the development of more, more steel and all that, right? And also it's sort of a positive feedback loop. Steel is heavy, so you need railroads to move steel, and because railroads need rails, railroads need steel. So it's a sort of positive feedback loop there. And finally, the last phase of the Industrial Revolution goes from about 1945, at the end of World War II, until the present, and you have the expansion of that into South America, Asia, and Africa. Talking about the automobile industry and the development of car production in South Korea, in South America, and South Africa, Australia, and other parts of the world. You have textile industries, clothing, right? Most of your clothes are designed in North America or Europe, but they are constructed in South America, Southeast Asia, and places like that. So, are there any questions so far on the phases of the Industrial Revolution before we turn our attention to why it starts in Britain? All righty. So, okay. So, Shabir, do you have a question?
Yeah, is it something to do with like the water systems that are in Britain?
Good. Yes, that's absolutely true. So Jessica asks what happened between 1820 and 1840. So that's what I was calling a gestational period. That's a period sort of where industries are growing. There's more investment in different. There's more investment in sort of different industries. Companies are beginning. Maybe some countries are starting to invest in the development of these industries. So it's a period where there's sort of groundwork being established. Does that make sense, Jessica? I'll take that as a yes. All right. So why Britain? So Britain is not special, right? In terms of its sort of cultural identity, in terms of its sort of basic natural resources. But there is something sort of special about Britain in terms of, if you bring all of these things together, what Britain has. So one of the first things comes with agriculture, right? Britain in the 1700s is unique in a couple of ways in terms of agriculture. Other parts of Europe had serfdom or had sort of this growing class of sort of poor peasant farmers. And Britain certainly had that. But in the 18th century, one of the things that emerges is a growing group of farmers who, the sort of lords, the earls, the marquises, the dukes, all those sort of fancy titles, they were becoming increasingly powerful, and they wanted to have sort of the most productive land possible. So these lords start to begin more scientific farming, crop rotations, and different types of fertilizers, and other types of products to help expand and develop these agricultural aspects. And the important piece about that is that that means that there's more food around, so that people, that with your surplus, people could now afford not to farm, and they could sort of move off and become, move to cities, move to towns, start to tinker, as it were. You also have a series of enclosure acts in the 1700s, the last of which is in 1773. And this enclosure act is an act that kicks the commoners off of common land. So one of the things that happened in the 1700s across Europe was that there was common land that people could supplement their income with, right? So if you were a small scale producer, maybe you used this common land to grow a patch of potatoes, or you used this common land to, put some sheep on or something. When these commoners are kicked off the land, they are again, they need to sort of find ways to supplement their income. And for some of them, that becomes industrial labor. Britain is this is one of the things that really is kind of unique to Britain, and that is a global empire. Britain, by the mid 1700s, and certainly by the late 1700s, by 1770 or so, Britain has a global empire. And Britain's global empire gives it certain infrastructures that don't exist in other parts of the world, right? Britain has giant banks. The Bank of England was established in the 1600s, and other banks, not just the Bank of England. And these banks, are giving out loans. They are well established. They are well trusted, so that if a person wants to fill a ship to sail to Bombay, India, or Boston, Massachusetts, there are ways for them to do that. Well, banks are also really important when somebody's trying to establish a factory, right? You're going to need loans in order to you're going to need loans in order to build a factory. So the fact that these banks exist gives them the ability to get those loans. You're also going to need insurance companies, right? Again, if you're filling up a boat to sail across the Atlantic or sail to India, you're going to need an insurance company to back you, right? You don't want to risk losing everything. Same thing is true for a factory. The last piece here is markets. As you produce more and more products in your factories and in your workshops, you need reliable places to offload that, and these markets are that. Daniel mentioned, or I think it was Daniel mentioned it a little while ago, or Shamir, maybe somebody mentioned about waterways. Waterways are important, right? Britain is an island. This is a map of Britain, and not really the purpose of this, right? But this Britain is an island. No matter where you are in Britain, you are never more than 70 miles from the coast, right? So, if we annotate this here, right? Even if you are here, you are never more than 70 miles from the coast, meaning that if you are producing goods, here, there are waterways to get you out to the coast to get your goods to market. So that if you are a, a textile merchant or whatever the case might be, right? You can easily get your goods out to where they need to go. Britain also has very reliable coal deposits, and they are relatively close to the surface. There are iron deposits, and they too are relatively close to the surface, meaning that if you are producing anything, you can easily, have access to coal to power your steam engine, or for those who are making steel, iron to turn into steel. And then cotton is, not only do you have easy access to cotton from places like India and the southern United States, but you also have sheep and wool, which can easily be grown in Britain in this period as well. So Britain, again, Britain is not sort of, let's say Britain is not sort of unique in Britain is not unique in the fact that it is Britain, but Britain is unique because it is sort of special in what it has. Okay. Are there questions so far about this? What we've been discussing so far about why Britain or the phases? Great. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. So one of the things about the Industrial Revolution and why I consider the Industrial Revolution still going on till today in 2024 is that there are phenomenon that exist and occur in the Industrial Revolution that, again, we still experience today. And one such example of that is uh, the first document in our packet today. So I just shared the document with you in the chat, if you'd like to open it. For those of you who were here a little while ago, I shared it with you earlier as well. So it's shared here in the chat. If you could please open it. Okay. So the first document here is a petition that is signed by these Leeds woolen workers. So where is Leeds? I will show you. So Leeds is kind of around here in sort of northeastern England, and they are protesting. They are protesting the introduction of something called a scribbling machine. So a scribbling machine is a machine that helps to make cloth more easily. So they're protesting the introduction of it. I also want to point out to you here, right, that this petition is produced in 1786, which is pretty early in the Industrial Revolution, right? We were only 36 years out, roughly, from 1750. So we are very close to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what I would like us to do here is this. I would like you to take, it's not very long, it's only about a page and a half. I would like you to take 2 minutes, please, and read the document. I would like you to tell me, so I will sort of tip my hand to this, right? There are 3 causes, 3 arguments that they are mentioning here about the Industrial Revolution and what the introduction of the scribbling machine does. I would like you to be able to discuss what those are in just a few moments. Okay, so let's come together now and discuss what is being argued here about the introduction of the scribbling machine. What is it that they are pointing out? So who could help us? You can just feel free to Is that sorry, your name's getting cut off. Is that Rena? Go ahead. You can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
It's just one of the main arguments is that it's taking away jobs and like livelihood from people.
Good.
Yeah.
Do you how many jobs are being taken away? What is the total impact of this?
So they said that you need 4 people for a machine, so it's taking away 12 jobs.
Yeah, it's taking away a lot of jobs, right? And you know the sort of unemployment level here is going to go up quite substantially. Excellent, good. What else is being impacted by the introduction of the scribbling machine? Conrad, go ahead.
Alrighty. It says that the petitioners argued that the use of scribbling machines have a negative impact on the quality of the cloth that is produced.
Yeah, very good, right? One of the other impacts is on the quality of the cloth, right? Talks about it frizzing and not having the sort of same quality that the product has when sort of handmade by these artisans. Um, I always think it's interesting that that doesn't appear that only appears at the bottom of the page, right? If I were trying to talk to you know, sort of factory owners, I might try and put that closer to the top. But anyway, good. And what is the final argument that they make about the impact of the introduction of the scribbling machine? So we have first, people become unemployed. Madrina told us, Conrad points out that the quality of the cloth is diminished. What is the third impact? Jessica, can you tell us what you mean by 4 generations, please? Very good. So Jessica tells us in the chat that it is that that it's really what's going to happen to the children, right? So it's brought up here at the bottom. You know, what's going to happen to the kids, right? Those children who, you know, are not going to be able to get employed, or not going to have the jobs that they might otherwise may have had access to. You know, what types of employment will they have? And even more importantly, right, you know, if they don't have good jobs, you know, they'll fall into crime. So not only are they going to be absent of jobs, but they're going to become criminals, right? So the implication is that this is not just, you know, not just a problem for not just a problem for the material, the cloth being poor, not just a problem for the hundreds of people being thrown out of their jobs, but it's also a problem for future generations, right? The kids and their sort of now criminal tendencies. The reason that I point this out is because when I talk about the Industrial Revolution and I talk about um, the implications of the Industrial Revolution and why I say the Industrial Revolution still goes on to today, is that these events are still going on now, right? What we just read about in this Leeds woolen manufacturers petition is what is called technological unemployment. Technological unemployment. Technological unemployment is as the name suggests, the unemployment of people due to technology, right? Sometimes it's called being made redundant. And you know, I think the first place that this occurs is in these artisan jobs, right? In the woolen manufacturers, um in the power looms and all those places. But then it still goes on today, right? In 2024, people are losing their jobs to technology all the time, and I think that's going to only increase with the introduction of AI and all. But you know, we have this happening again still in 2024 and onward. Good. Are there any questions about that about technological unemployment and the Industrial Revolution. All right. So that's technological unemployment, and that is the introduction of the steam engine and all of these other new technologies. The next big change here, and Britain is a really good example of this, is mass urbanization. Cities, so as we said a few moments ago, as um, factories no longer need to be tied to rivers and streams, they can now begin moving into more consolidated and more different areas for production purposes. So one of the things that's going to happen here is that towns and cities are going to become increasingly populated. So why is that the case? So from 1750 until 1850, global population doubles. And for the first time in human history, human population hits 1 billion people around 1800. So it takes, the first cities are founded in 6000 BCE. It takes 7,800 years for the population of the globe to hit 1 billion people. And in the last 224 years, the global population has gone up to over 8 billion, right? So that shows you that the Industrial Revolution, access to products, et cetera, has led to a steep incline in population growth. Now, why is that? One of the things is that in Europe, at least, there is a relative peace, right? I'm not saying there aren't wars. We know that there's, after 1750, there are certainly wars. There's, the world wars of the 20th century. There's wars, all over the place, but they are less extremely violent, I suppose. You also have better agriculture. As we said a few moments ago, there is sort of more scientific farming. Food is better. Food is stronger. We have more caloric foods. But it's also access to products, better clothing, better homes. And all of these things help lead to population growth. In 1750, there were only 22 cities in Europe with a population of 100,000 or more. Within 100 years, that number more than doubles to over 47 cities with 100,000 people or more. There are just more people living in cities with access to goods and commodities that they previously did not have. When we talk about population growth and population movement, we often talk about this in terms of push and pull factors. Push factors being factors that make people leave where they are, and pull factors are the things that attract them to certain places. So, for these rural workers who are now moving into cities and towns, what are those what are those push factors? Why would they leave agriculture? Does anybody have any ideas why people might leave agriculture and go to cities during the Industrial Revolution?
I guess for the profit.
What about profit, Nagito?
Like work in a factory will lead to like new machinery stuff, and at that time machinery work was more popular than the agriculture.
Okay, so part of it certainly is access to better commodities and better goods, right? And I think, sort of embedded in what Nagima is saying is also this idea of profitability, right? If I work on a farm and I, struggle all year and I grow my patch of potatoes, but we get a bad rain and it wipes out my crop, I've lost all of my year's work. But then other times I might have a great year and I might have a surplus and make a ton of money. But in a factory job, right, you know, I don't have the risk of, you know, losing everything. I may never make the big payout, but I also won't sort of have the big loss. And, you know, my pay will be consistent and stable. So that's certainly a push factor. You know, this is the 1800s for the Irish and other parts of Europe. There's going to be the potato famine, obviously most pronounced in Ireland, that is going to push people out. And the pull factors, I think we sort of already discussed. So if you look here, right, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have towns and cities that are going to grow exponentially, right? You have a place like Birmingham that starts the 1800s at about 74,000 people. By the time you get to the end of the century, in 1891, your Birmingham's looking at a population of about 523,000 people, right? An increase of nearly 7 times, right? 7 times 7. You have Leeds, you know, going from 50,000 to 429, and a population increase of what? About 8 times. So you have these massive growth in population that is occurring here in the 1800s. And this map, I think, is helpful for us to look at this, right? You know, this is a map of Britain in the 1701, and then on the verge of World War I, right? London, always urbanized, but look at how much more densely populated London is. Cardiff in Wales goes from fairly not populated to fairly populated. And the case is the same for Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle up here in North England. You know, again, we could sort of look at these again. I want to look at this chart just a little bit more closely first, and then we'll turn our attention to some of the problems that are emerging here. So this chart I found a couple of years ago, and I reproduced it here. And I think it's really great at showing the rapid growth of urbanization on a global scale, right? So globally, in 1600, about 5% of the world's population lived in urban environments. That number stays very consistent up until about 1800, between 5 and 7% of the population becoming increasingly urbanized. But then look at how quickly the world population becomes urbanized by the time you get to 1900 and then by 2000. And you can see where that change is occurring. In Western Europe, right, Britain, France, you know, that number is going from 12 to 13 to 21. And most of that, this increase here between 13 and 21, between 1700 and 1800, that's going to be Britain, maybe France in some cases. North America, look at how rapidly it goes up. And you know, even North America by 2000, 79% of North America, 75% of Western Europe is urbanized. Africa, again, maybe it takes longer for that to occur, but certainly by the time you get to 2000, right? So you can see the speed and the rapidity with which this occurs. Now, this is not all good news, right? You know, at Nagima's point about access to commodities and the better products is certainly part of that, but this is not 100% a good thing. Because of the rapid growth of these cities, and again, I just draw your attention back to this chart and how quickly this occurs, right? Cities can't keep up, right? The infrastructure and the infrastructure and the sanitation of these cities was not meant to expand this quickly, right? If you look again, if you go back to this chart, you know, from 1800 to 1861, so 60 years, you know, the population of Birmingham goes up 4 times. The population of Leeds goes up 4 times. The population of Liverpool goes up, you know, over 4 times, 4.5 times, and the other 5 times, I guess. So the infrastructure was just not prepared to handle that. So this causes many of these urban populations to live with huge amounts of disease and huge amounts of you know, urban overpopulation. In order to help this, some companies begin to buy more land to make companies buy land to make their own towns, and I'll give an example of that, give a couple of examples of that in a few moments. So the urban population grows very, very quickly. Yes, so Ishan asks, was there an increase in crime? And there absolutely is an increase in crime, right? Again, because not only do you have more and more people living in closer and closer proximity to one another, but you also have, poor people who are working in very, very tough conditions. But then not only are they working in tough conditions, but they are being paid very poorly. So they're going to desire, commodities that they may not have access to. So there is certainly an increase in crime. So I want us to draw our attention to the next document. So I want to draw your attention to this next document by a guy named Friedrich Engels. Does anybody recognize that name, Friedrich Engels? He may not be the most popular person, but his friend, his very close friend is. Does anybody know who his close friend was? Karl Marx. Very good, Armando and Nicholas. So Friedrich Engels' close friend and sort of intellectual partner was Karl Marx, the guy who is responsible, I suppose, for modern socialism, communism. Friedrich Engels was a factory owner and a industrialist in Manchester. And Karl Marx was in and out of employment for much of his life, and he had 7 children with his wife Jenny. So he is sort of always a desperate need of money. And Engels was often the provider of that. Engels lived in Manchester and commented on the conditions of Manchester City. If you could please, I would like you to read this description of the river in Manchester. So that is the River Irk, which I'm highlighting here. And then down here, so up here, he talks about the living conditions that people are in. And down here, he's discussing the river itself and how sort of polluted it is. So what I would like us to do now is take a few moments and read this document. So I will just for those of you who are using this, I will zoom in here a little bit. And for those of you who are reading on my screen, for those of you who have yours at home, that's fine. So I will leave this here, and then I'll scroll down in a moment. So, and we will come back and discuss. So all right. So, let's discuss the condition of Manchester City. If you could, I haven't mentioned this yet tonight, but if people could please turn their cameras on, it'd be helpful just to not seem like I'm talking to myself in my basement. So let's discuss Manchester. So what are the living conditions that people are, what are the conditions that people are living in? And then what is the condition of the River Irk? So we'll start with Cassandra. And then if others have comments, please chime in as well. Go ahead, Cassandra.
Yeah, so in the first paragraph, he's saying like that the streets are like narrow and everything is like run down, and it's the area he's in is like predominantly working class area. And like the houses are like crammed together without like a plan, creating like a really crowded and bad environment. And then for the river, he talks about how like polluted it is and like how the factories and bone mills are like all around it, creating like these gross like slime pools and like emitting bad smell and just like saying how bad it is.
Excellent, very good. Right. So first, right, he mentions, the sort of crowded conditions, the cramped conditions that people are living in. And again, he doesn't sort of he sort of implies this, I suppose, but he's mentioning the Irish there. This is written. This excerpt is written in the 1844, right? So this is just really as the worst part of the potato famine is about to begin, right? So we have, he mentions Irish people there, so we sort of see this increased immigration part of it. Yeah, and then he mentions the sort of slime pools that the river endures. What is, so we have different factories that are there, right? You mentioned Cassandra, you mentioned bone mills. Does anybody know what a bone mill does? I guess the name is sort of self-explanatory, but they may sort of have a thought about what it does or why it might be important. So a bone mill grinds up animal bones in order to produce tallow and tallow soap. So that was a type of soap that was produced. You also have tanneries. Anybody know what a tannery does?
It tans leather.
Good. It tans leather, so it takes the hide from animals and turns it into leather products. And then you have gasworks, right? So producing kerosene and things like that. In the second line of the second paragraph, it talks about the bubbles of miasmatic gases. So miasmatic or miasma was a theory about how disease and how sickness spread through this sort of miasma theory, the existence of foul air. So there's this idea that disease is spreading through this grossness. Again, in a world prior to germ theory or understanding how bacteria worked, this is what people believed caused illnesses and caused diseases. What do you think the impact of Friedrich Engels' writing here would be? What is he drawing attention to? Or who is he hoping to push to action? Or even knowing who his more famous buddy is, what is the purpose of this? I think for a lot of people, right, the purpose that Engels is trying to have here is trying to show everyone to show all people, to show people living in Britain and people living, in the countryside, these rich industrialists, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, right? To show them how brutal city life can be and how terrible city life was for these people who are working in the factories. All right, so in order to try and keep people close to the factories, many companies started to build what were called company towns. So I am going to share my screen again with you here. So companies developed what were called company towns, and the purpose of these company towns was to extract or to have a lot of control over their workers' lives. It was also to keep the workers close by, right? if they rented a home or if they rented a place from the company, it would obviously be relatively close to where they worked. So they wouldn't have to travel or commute very far. And as many workers worked 12, 14 hours a day, this was a convenient piece to them. In some cases, some of these company towns tried to produce, ideas of social reforming, right? Trying to instill more of these what we would call middle class values. And again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But this was, this was again a place that could, at least on paper, maybe seem like a good place to be, but not always, that great. So I wanted to sort of tell you a little story here, and then we'll get back to this. So I want to just tell a little story here about, so as I sometimes say, from the Haller Family Archive. So my grandfather grew up in a pretty good example. So my grandfather was from a town in Scotland called Newton Grange. So Newton Grange is in Scotland. It's just outside of the capital city of Edinburgh, and it is, again, a perfect example of a company town. So at the top of the town, there is a mine. It's a coal mining town. It is now closed. It is now a museum, but there's a coal mine at the top of the town. And then there's a main street that comes down, and then there's another street that sort of goes, kind of creates a perpendicular street pattern. When you come down from the mine, as you sort of if you're coming in this direction, these are blocks of homes that were called the miners' cottages. The miners' cottages. These cottages were built by the mining company. The company was called the Midlothian Coal Company, and they were cookie cutter homes. Every home was exactly the same. When you walked in the front door, there was a living room to your left, 2 bedrooms in the back, and a little kitchen, and that was it, right? It was just a very simple home, exactly the same across the board. Again, and this is not drawn perfectly. The distance between the sort of top of the hill here and the mine was maybe a quarter of a mile, right? It was a very, very short distance. Now, as you walked down, right, on your left is the cottages. Sorry, on the right is the cottages. On this side of the road, there's a pub that was owned by the company, so that when you bought your beer, and at the end of the day or at the end of the week, whatever, you bought it from the factory, the company. And at the bottom of the block here, the street here, was the store, right? And again, that would have been something owned by the company, so that when you bought your groceries, again, you were buying it from the ostensibly the factory. Again, in the center of the sort of blocks of homes here is a church, a Christian church, where if you were not in attendance on Sunday, you may get spoken to on Monday morning. So again, this is a way for the factory, for the company, to really exude and exert as much power as possible on their people. So it was, again, it was a very, very strict way for people to live. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so a couple of examples here, right? So company towns, my grandfather's town, so a piece to this, right, is in a mining town, you might assume that everybody is a coal miner, and that's not exactly the case. My grandfather was not a coal miner. My great-grandfather was. My great-grandfather was a coal miner who was, down in the middle of the mines. My grandfather was a mechanic, His job was to fix the trucks that drove the coal around until he immigrated to the United States. My great uncle was the elevator operator who took the elevator up and down, however many times a day. My uncle, I guess my grandfather's brother, my great uncle, who passed away only a couple of months ago, at the age of 83. He did not work for the mine. He worked for a beer company, driving a beer truck, right? So this town was, had a lot of the miners in it, and they worked for the mine, doing different jobs. But not everybody in the town had to work for the mine. They could do something else. Now, there are good examples of company towns, and there are bad examples of company towns. A good example of a company town is also in Scotland, and that is a town called New Lanark, which is in southwestern Scotland, outside of the city of Glasgow. And this is established as a mill to make cloth in the late 1700s, and in the early 1800s, a guy by the name of Robert Owen takes over the town and develops it into a good example of a company town. The mill at its height employed and housed about 2,500 workers and about 500 children. Children were given education, free education, provided by the company. And if fine. So part of that was that it operated as a type of daycare, I suppose, right? So that the workers didn't have to worry about their kids. But it was also, a way to make sure that they were, getting educated and fulfilling their own lives. For the 2,500 workers, right? Again, some of them worked in front of the power looms and all that. But at the end of the day, you could go and work, go to school, and you could again try and improve yourself to get promoted. There were physicians employed in order to provide health care to the people in the factory. They by the middle of the 1800s, there was and that's what these homes are back here. Every worker was entitled to have a multi-room apartment with running water. It was made out of brick. And by the end of the 1800s, well after Owen had died, they had established an electric generator so that people had electricity in their homes. Again, uncommon in Britain at the time. So this was a good example where a factory could help, at least attempt, to make the lives of their workers better. But then there is the bad. And this is an example of Port Sunlight, which is in Cheshire, in northern England. And this is the Lever brothers, if anybody here has ever heard of Lever soap. The brothers who owned and operated the Lever manufacturing at Port Sunlight, they believed that workers needed to be improved, that workers were inherently subservient, inherently sort of bad, and needed improvement. And they believed that it was one of the jobs of the manufacturers to try and improve the lives of their people. So they put in what is called paternalism in action, the idea of trying to make their employees better by sort of social control. So they sort of, one of the ideas of one of the thoughts about sort of these middle class values was sobriety. So there would be a curfew. They would try to close pubs at certain times in order, again, to try and instill this sobriety. They would try to enforce frugality, the idea of saving money. they forced religious observance. So again, in my grandfather's town, if you might get spoken to if you weren't at mass, and might get spoken to even more if you weren't there for a couple of weeks or a couple of you missed a couple of services. But in Port Sunlight, person could lose their job if they were not at the religious services. So all of this again is trying to exercise very, very strong social control on the people in their towns. So finally, what is one of the other impacts of these was another impact of all of this urbanization, not just sanitation, not just company towns, but there's also a political aspect to this. By the early 1800s, cities and towns are becoming increasingly underrepresented. So what do I mean by that? Prior to this mass urbanization, all of the parts of Britain were represented in very similar ways. Counties had, X number of representatives in parliament. But by the time you get to the early and mid 1800s, and cities start to grow into the hundreds of thousands of people and so on, cities are very poorly represented relative to other parts of Britain. If you go back to the map that we looked at a few moments ago, if you go back to this map from a few moments ago, right? When you look at, the growth of, or the change, in a place like Cardiff, where there's, something like 65 to 120 people per square mile, but now you go to it where there's over 500 people per square mile. There's this, the representation doesn't change much in this time period. So one of the things that needs to be called for is a change in this type of representation. And the places that were once the places that are now significantly less populated than they previously were are now having the same representation as other parts of Britain that are much more densely populated. And that creates a situation where we have what are called rotten boroughs, where you sort of have these old style representation in a place that doesn't necessarily warrant that. To combat this, in the 1830s, there is a beginning of a movement called the British People's Charter, sometimes called Chartism. The British People's Charter begins to ask for better representation for general people in Britain. Now, I should point out to you, this is a petition. This is not like a law. This is not an act. This is something that people are signing up on to try and get better representation. It is not successful. It doesn't really go anywhere. A lesser law is passed eventually in the 1840s, and over 1 million people ultimately sign this charter. But what is important about it is that it's the first real example of average people being involved in a political action, right? The average people asking for better political representation. And that is a big shift that occurs here in the Industrial Revolution, where you have more and more people demanding their sort of the respect that they have earned as a result of their work and as of their participation in the government, right? So, the demand here is for better democratic representation. So you can see that here, that from and after the passing of this act, every male inhabitant of these realms be entitled to vote for the election of a member of parliament, subject, however, to the following conditions: being enacted that for the purpose of attaining equal representation of the people in the Commons House of Parliament, the United Kingdom be divided into 300 electoral districts, that each such district contain, as nearly as may be, an equal number of inhabitants. Again, this idea that population should be a component of this representation, and more densely populated areas should be more democratically represented. The purpose of this again is is to try and open these types of representation. And again, it doesn't go anywhere. Nothing happens from this, but it shows us the political activity that these underclasses are starting to feel. Are there questions? Okay. Our last piece here on working conditions and the work that people are doing and the ways in which lives have changed is this. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the way people worked, 95% of the population worked in agrarian lifestyle. They worked on farms. They worked as hands on farms. They leased or rented land in order to produce their goods. And agrarian lifestyle is a much different style of lifestyle than the lifestyle that people had in the Industrial Revolution. So in agrarian lifestyle, a person works for roughly 2/3 of the year. From roughly March through October, most people, farming goes on, right? People are working 12 hours a day, tending their crops, irrigating, weeding, taking care of those commodities. And then harvest is in October. And from roughly November through roughly this time of the year in February, there's little farming that's going on. You might be fixing tools, you might be taking care of your home, but you're not doing heavy farming. Even once you are farming from March through October, there are different times of the year where your job is going to be tougher, right? Whether that's when you're putting the seeds in and when you're trying to get the irrigation ready to go. But then, there's weeding and things like that. So, but your time is sort of sun-based, right? When the sun comes up, you can start working. When the sun goes down, you can end working. And it's not necessarily, you get to direct your own time, I guess. It's also, if you are working on a farm, if you are working on a farm, you are renting it from the landlord. You might employ your children and your spouse. You have direct relationships with the people who are employed by you and who are employing you. All of this changes in the Industrial Revolution. When you move to factory labor, almost nothing is the same. Instead of sort of having this seasonal and cyclical aspect to your life, you may be now working 14 hours a day in a dingy factory that is very dangerous, has poor ventilation, has giant machines that don't have any guardrails or anything on it. You work 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, 0 vacation days. If you get injured, no workman's compensation. All of this is extremely dangerous stuff. It's also mind-numbingly monotonous, right? The type of work that you are doing is, you might be putting stuff into a loom and doing the same motion day in and day out. So it is something that is dangerous. It's boring. And again, it's something that is going on all the time. So factory work can be really tough, right? Buildings are poorly ventilated. I'm sure some of you, particularly probably people who are from New York, you may have heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which happens in 1911 in Lower Manhattan, where you have hundreds of young women working in a mill, and the doors are locked, the windows are locked, so that when a fire broke out, there was no way to escape, and many young women jump to their death. out of the windows, right? So again, there are these huge real situations where people are impacted by this. If factories are dangerous, mines, I think or in my opinion, mines are even more deadly and dangerous. Mines, coal mines and other types of mines are thousands of feet underground. You're taking an elevator down to the coal face, and they are extremely dangerous. There are mines that collapse pretty consistently. In order to break the coal out of the mine, you're using a chisel and a hammer. You might unleash natural gas, which is what comes out of your stove when you are cooking. So you're dealing with these explosive products. This is in an era, in many cases, prior to electrical, and prior to electrical lighting. So people might be using candles and oil lamps to light their way. So you're dealing with flammable material and you have an open flame. You're talking about a situation that is just extremely brutal. And people, are inhaling coal dust. They are inhaling natural gas, and this is going to cause a condition called black lung that can cause a whole bunch of different types of cancers. So these are extremely dangerous conditions that people are living and working in during the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, as we've been saying, is a period that starts around 1750 or so, and it is a period that sees the rapid growth of access to commodities, better clothing, better products, the introduction of railroads and steamships, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It's the bringing in of factory labor and urbanization and the dangers that those bring, whether that's in the factory or to the environment. All these implications are hugely important, and from this moment forward, right, we're only a couple of weeks into the semester, but only at this point into the semester, from this point forward, one of the things I will consistently say is because we are in the industrial age, because the industrial revolution is underway, and when we talk, about imperialism, when we talk about revolutions of 1848, whenever we talk about anything, the Industrial Revolution is going to be in the background. And it's important for us to see that even this early into the semester, this is going to be something that is going to be with us and drive a lot of our conversations going forward. Okay. So